My spirit name, I'm from Mississipaugastic Cree Nation. It's Mississipaugastic. That's in Grand Rapids, Manitoba. It's one of the sites of Manitoba's first hydro dam developments in 1960. So the name Mississipaugastic means the rushing waters, the Great Rapids. And since the dam was built, there's been no more rapids. But we hold on to our traditional name nonetheless. It's actually quite sad. The elders will tell you that the river used to sing their children to sleep, and now there's barely any rest. So a lot of the work that I do now, in the bio, it says I'm working for Treaty 5 nations, the Summit of Treaty 5 Sovereign Nations. But I left that job in September to work with my own nation, Mississipaugastic Cree Nation. And I'm working with my own nation now to help develop our own laws, try to bring some kind of capital into the community, and a lot of effort towards step-by-step on self-determination. Citizenship codes, election codes, land codes, declarations of rights, declarations of jurisdiction, but particularly I'm working with the Child Family Services. That's the main focus right now, to develop our own laws around child welfare. Now, when I say law, I'm not talking about, section 1, subsection 2, all that nonsense. I'm talking about things that are more inherent to the traditional form, more understandable to the people in an inherent way, in easily practicable law, because our laws don't come from paper or documents. Our laws come from the land and our relationships around us. More of a background here, my spirit name is Kapmatat Pinesu. Roughly translates to walking thunderbird. But if you, and I understand Lindsay went through a breakdown of the kind of the syllabics behind the name. The true meaning of Kapmatat Pinesu is one who walks with the thunder beings, learns from them, and continues their teachings. And that's important because the Thunderbirds were the original lawmakers, and they did that through stories. They did that through stories on to our villages, to our communities, and I got that name, maybe like 20 years ago. I didn't really understand the significance of it until after I went in and studied law. I'm Bear Clan, and Bear Clans are family protectors and treaty protectors, which again, didn't really feel the significance of it until I started really getting into the work that I'm involved with now, and quite happy doing that. So yeah, I kind of avoided working with First Nation politics. My father was a prominent, or is a prominent First Nations leader, and traveling around with him as a youth brought me a lot of insight, a lot of understanding of what the issues are, what treaties mean, what the relationship between Canada and Indigenous people is. And it kind of struck the soul, struck the spirit enough for me to be, I worked in construction for about the first 15, 20 years, because it was just easier to count numbers than it was to count deficits and turmoils. Finally, I turned my attention around to it though, when I moved back to Winnipeg a while ago, and I worked with Manitoba Chiefs of the North, Manitoba Kiwatnu Algamaganak, which is the Manitoba Chiefs of the North. I was doing communications for them, but I was through communications involved in a whole array of issues that were going around, from fishing issues to the release of the duty to consult, and always being embedded in the First Nation perspective on those installations, I guess you would call them, more of a impositions. And nothing that I saw, and still nothing that I've seen, has really been premised on the First Nations perspective of what our rights are, what needs to happen. And then I worked for Native Child Family Services, where I met my good friend Lindsay. Here I honor her in my own living room. She painted that. I worked for Native Child Family Services developing funding proposals and programs. And it was very troubling for me because I was always looking at the negatives, because you can't fix the negatives until you understand them. So I was looking at the way children were being raised, the way families were treating each other, the way our relationship to the city was, and to the province, and to the government of the federal government. And in every proposal, I would always put the Indigenous remedy. You know, what I've been taught from my elders and what I've been taught from knowledge keepers about what our nations need to heal ourselves and to bring ourselves back up to where we belong. And it troubled me because many of the responses from the government were, well, we'll fund this aspect of it, but we won't give money for elders. We won't give money for spiritual needs, ceremonies. We won't give money for medicines, that kind of stuff. I always wonder, like, well, who do you think you're dealing with if you're going to ignore our identity? So that frustrated me enough to go and pursue the study of law. Because, you know, when you get addicted to frustration, nothing better than going to study law. So then I started at Queen's Law, but I went into it at about 85%, thinking that everybody understood what a treaty was. People understood what the Indigenous relationships were with the Crown, and the Crown meaning all of the government of Canada, and what their general relationship was to other Canadians. And the knowledge, it's better now than it was even when I was younger, just certainly when my elders were younger, but it still didn't exist. And all through law school, I heard about Section 35, which is Canada's Constitution. Section 35 protects Aboriginal rights. It affirms and recognizes Aboriginal rights. But my question was always, well, who defined that? Who said these are what Aboriginal rights are? If you really break it down, they keep us as a what's a proper, the etiquette way of saying it is, they keep us as savages in the minds of Canadians. We hunt, we fish, we gather. Those are our rights. We get to remain as those Indian people. But it doesn't say anything about our right to have a relationship to the land, and our right to protect the waters, our rights to honor our women. There's nothing in that that's Indigenous. And that's the stark difference between Canadian law and Indigenous law. So when I came away from that, I wrote a lot of papers about the subjugation and the injustices. And when I came away from law school, I refused to practice law. I did try out for the bar. And then when I passed the barrister, but I didn't pass the solicitor, and I took that as a meaning, and I, sat down with myself and my spirit, and I said, well, there's probably a good reason for that, because I don't belong in that world. I don't belong in that colonial law. When I did articling, one of the pivotal moments for me was when we were making a claim, and through the law, we had to admit, or at least state, that the Indigenous powers to make law came from the Indian Act. So what the hell is that? The Indian Act didn't exist thousands of years ago, but we did. And we had laws, and we had treaties, and we had relationships. And it just made no sense to me. And there was no way I was ever going to write down our power comes from the Indian Act, because that's a forced subjugation, further assimilation. So that's what brought me back to Manitoba again, where I worked with the sovereign nations of Treaty 5. And our goal there is to reinvigorate Indigenous sovereignty, to remove ourselves from the Indian Act. Specifically in 1875, Treaty 5 was made between the Cree and the Sioux and the Ojibwe and the Dene here in Manitoba. But that's been unilaterally interpreted so much that our influence on the interpretation is almost non-existent. So it was an exercise of reminding ourselves who we are. So we would travel to the 40 different First Nations of Treaty 5, and we would talk to them about the truth, the history, the relationship, why we don't have the authority that our ancestors knew. And we know that our ancestors had authority because the Crown made treaty with our ancestors. And the Crown can't make treaty with other Canadian citizens. You can't make treaty with your own subjects. But through that treaty, they unilaterally interpreted us as subjects. And instead of fulfilling the treaty through their legislation, they gave us the Indian Act. And the Indian Act turns around to say, you can't do this, you can't leave your reserve unless you have permission. You have to identify yourselves as Indians at all times. You can't sell anything from your reserve. You can't sell parts of your reserve. You basically can't participate in the economy that we're taking from you. And our interpretation of the treaty has always been that we will share the responsibility of the land. I say responsibility of the land because it's not just sharing the land. A lot of acknowledgements do state that we will share the land, but that means something completely different to our society and Canadian society. We're not a capitalistic based. We don't see the land as a commodity. We see the land as something that we have a responsibility towards. So that's what I mean. We have the responsibility to share that land and mutually benefit from what that land provides for us, as it's always provides for us. And so that kind of long way of leading into what we know about the York region, one small segment of all of Canada, but the treaties exist the same way that they did for us. Unilateral interpretations by a government that assumed racial superiority over another class of people. So what really started the whole treaty process was, well, there was the 1600 Peace and Friendship Treaties, which are the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick kind of areas. They're very vague, very, very vague. But they're not as vague as what the Toronto Purchase was. And the land that you're on in Toronto is known as the Toronto Purchase. In 1787, the Crown made a treaty, quote unquote treaty, with the Mississaugas of the Bay of Quinte. And that treaty was to extend from Kingston all the way to Niagara. That process, sorry, I get ahead of myself. That process stemmed from the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The King recognized that there was a lot of disputes, a lot of battles going on between the Indigenous people and the settler society. And it was all over land, improperly, poorly claimed land. And the Indigenous people weren't just going to sit there and be like, oh yeah, no, nice cabin. We appreciate that you built that on our burial grounds, or on our ceremony grounds, or where we hunt and gather. So those disputes went back to the King, and the King made the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And essentially, it admits that Indigenous people have their own laws, because there's a section of it that says if a settler criminal is found on the reserve, you cannot go onto the reserve and take him away for justice, take him or her away for justice. And that was because they recognized that we had our own laws and our own dispute resolutions. And again, that was eroded with over time. But in the Royal Proclamation 1763, it says you cannot take land from the Indigenous people unless by a meeting and a vote of the majority of the men. And I say men because that's important, because you're dealing with, in this territory, you're dealing with a lot of matriarch societies, meaning that women have a lot of authority. In our society, in Cree society, they don't have more authority. Nobody has more authority than anybody else because there's no hierarchy. A chief was not somebody who came in like a Justin Trudeau or like any other kind of dictator saying this is what we're going to do. A chief was a representative of the nation, a spokesperson, an advocate, someone who was able to articulate what our wants and desires were. And the women played a significant role because in our society, in Cree society, Newa, Cree women were known as, I guess you could say, property owners. Again, I use the term owner graciously because we don't really own anything. We're gifted things and we have responsibility to things and we have to take care of those things. But the women's primary role in the community was to raise the children, guide them towards their path, and manage the land and resources. And then through consensus, the community would make decisions on what they were going to do in that relation. But the women weren't involved in the treaty making process. Right? So already the government of the Crown, which became the government of Canada in 1930-ish, at that time had no respect for their own women. So how were they going to respect our women? And we had high respect for our women. Over the years, that's recently been more of what I've personally seen is a lot of women are regaining their status, rightfully so. And in any way that I can, I'll move aside, right? Does anybody have a dog? Because I'm gonna let mine out for a second.
No, Lindsay has one.
He gives me some trouble every now and then. There are a lot to handle.
He doesn't like my talks. He's like, you're talking too much. Let me outside. Anyway, yeah. So the Crown didn't respect our women, so they moved them aside from the treaty process, and they made this rule that you can't take land from the Indigenous people unless you have a consensus of the majority of men. So that was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, importantly, just as importantly, from our society's view, was the Treaty of Niagara. The Treaty of Niagara was done in 1764, 1 year after the Royal Proclamation, and that was more of a ceremonial gathering. Indigenous people came from all over these lands, met in Niagara, had ceremony, had talks, had gathered and celebrated the idea that we were all going to have a mutually beneficial relationship. And that's how our treaties were made. We were made through spirit. We weren't made through parchment and paper. It wasn't like a signing of this and a signing of that, and that deal is done. Which brings me back to 1787. There was a treaty made with the Mississaugas of the Bay of Quinte, like I said, and what was lacking in that was any description of the land that was apparently sold for 10 shillings. No description of the land. And further to that, no signatures were on the document itself. They had attached on separate pages the symbols of the leadership. Now, the symbols themselves, like I said, I'm Bear Clan, so if I'd imagine back in that time, I would have drawn my symbol as the Bear Clan, saying I'm putting my responsibilities towards this treaty. Like I said, the responsibility of taking care of family, the responsibility of taking care of honoring treaty, upholding the law. I would have signed that portion of my responsibility to the document, but it didn't exist. So they came back, the Crown came to survey the lands that weren't described in 1788, a year later, and they were met with a lot of opposition, not surprisingly. And it wasn't until 10 years later that the land was more delineated, more clarified on August 1st of 1805. And at that time, the Crown purchased 250,830 acres for 10 shillings, and York region being part of that treaty. It's also known confusingly as the Williams Treaty, but that's just kind of like a broader version, a broader amalgamation, I guess, of treaties. So 1787, And then 201 years later, the Mississaugas, the First Nation, were finally able to put a claim forward to Canada's courts, no exception to bias, to Canada's courts. They filed a claim saying that the Crown acquired more lands than they agreed to, such as the Toronto Islands. They weren't apparently part of the original agreement. And they disputed the purchase amount, 10 shillings for 250,000 acres. I don't know what that amounts to, but it sounds like I could buy my neighbor's house for $5. I don't think he'd be happy about that. What I say that they were finally able to put a claim forward, it's because the Indian Act between early 19th century and mid 19th century disallowed Indigenous people to bring claims of land towards to the courts. So we had no avenue to fight these injustices. That's 50 years is 1 or 2 generations, right? Like your grandparents your grandparents would have at one point said, there's no justice for us, so we would have given up. And then they wouldn't have continued that fight to their grandchildren because they knew that that wasn't there was no avenue for justice on it, right? We would have to find a way to negotiate or something like that. And finally, when that was lifted, a lot of claims came through. So many so that the government of Canada created its own process, the specific claims and special claims tribunals to hear Indigenous land claims, which again, we knew of and tried to raise. We were kind of shouting against a brick wall for the last 60 to 70 years. Finally, we had this process and we flooded them with all these claims. So when you hear terms like land back, and you question, what do you mean land back? Well, you're only hearing about it now because your government didn't allow us to make that claim anytime sooner. A lot of history had been lost during that time. A lot of stories on the land were lost. A lot of families' usage of the lands were lost. So there's been a huge detriment to Indigenous people. Again, like I said, would imagine what we could have done if the treaties were honored. We wouldn't be the most impoverished people in our own lands. We'd have access to resources. We'd be able to make laws about who gets to mine in what territory and what we get to benefit from if you do get to mine in our territory. But all of that was stripped away from us, so rendered completely powerless, which is not what our treaty was supposed to be about. The treaty essentially was the Crown acknowledging that we're our own governing people, we acknowledging that the Crown is its own governing people, and living in coexistence, sharing and abiding by each other's terms, but not interfering. The wampum is probably the best example of that non-interference. But it's in every treaty so far that I've seen. In the numbered treaties specifically, it says there's a non-molestation clause. We will not interfere with each other's ways of life. I don't see how the government of Canada doesn't recognize that when they limit us to hunting, gathering, and fishing, and those rights. Anyway, so that claim 201 years later was finally settled in 2010. So 233 years or 223 years later, after the Indigenous people were like, hey, this is wrong. It took Canada, the Crown, 233 years to say, I guess, yeah, you know, you're right. And they settled that portion of it for 145 million. That doesn't provide the justice that many feel is deserved, because like I said, 145 million for a land that has produced billions of dollars is not exactly justifiable, but it's something, right? So when you do land acknowledgements, you have to consider what was lost. Yeah, what are you sharing? What do you mean by sharing the land? You're not sharing the land by holding somebody's hand and singing Kumbaya while you're eating rich and they're eating poor, right? Like you're having a steak and they're having a hot dog and you're sharing a meal. It's not exactly the same thing. It's not. That's not how our society views fairness. And again, the purchase of land was such a foreign concept to people who didn't own land. Our only relationship to the land was that it provides for us, and we have agreements with the land to take care of it. The animals, same thing. We don't kill for fun. We eat for sustenance. We hunt for sustenance, but for clothing, for tools. And that's an agreement that the animals made with Creator. That's probably one of our first known treaties. Actually, it probably would be our first treaty because men were stupid. Human beings are dumb. Like, we can't survive on this land because we have no competence to do so. We would starve, we would freeze, we would die. So with the animals, when Creator made humankind, this is our story. The animals and fish and the birds recognized that we were kind of silly, and they wanted to help. So they said, well, I'll give up my spirit for these people as long as they agree to take care of us, because they have, as human beings, we have means and we have capabilities that animals don't have, right? So maybe we can build shelters and whatnot. So the animals willingly give their lives up for us because they want us to take care of them. And that's the same with the land. The land will provide for us, but we have to take care of the land. We don't just take from the land. Like, the commodity thing is, you can't just buy land in our society. You can't just buy land and say, yeah, I own it now and I'm going to do what I want with it. Because look at fracking, right? Like, as an example, fracking is a non-indigenous way of looking at land as a commodity, doing what you want with it and causing major destruction to it, which leaves it unrenderable and unusable for future generations. And in our society, we're always looking 7 generations ahead, because that's our treaty with our great grandchildren, is to take care of them, to make sure that they have a good life. So treaties really mean a lot more than just, sure, here, go ahead, use all the land and rule over us. That's not at all what they're supposed to do. Before the Toronto Purchase, though, what you were dealing with in the York region was the dish and one spoon, which was mentioned in the opening. And the dish was one spoon wampum was, again, the Iroquois and the Ojibwe agreeing to live peaceably. And that's the premise of basically indigenous societies, was we will live together in harmony because we don't have a hierarchy. We don't believe one's better than another. We don't believe that one ways are better than other people's ways. I mean, we do now, like Cree ways are definitely better than Ojibwe ways, but that's off the table. That's a sidebar. But it's that view of, we have to live in harmony. And how are we going to live in harmony? We're going to let you be your people. We'll let us be our people. We won't create war. And when we do create war, we'll seek to have peaceful resolution. So again, like I said, if you're doing a land acknowledgement and you claim that, we're grateful for sharing the land, well, take a look at the housing on First Nations reserves. Like, there's no sharing. You have beautiful houses, beautiful buildings, structures, universities, libraries, these amazing buildings. And you go to a reserve and you have moss-filled, broken windowed, run-down homes, right? What did you share exactly? And how do you say you're sharing the land with Indigenous people when for like half a century we weren't even allowed into the cities or into the buildings or into the schools and the universities? There was no sharing. And that's not what reconciliation is. Reconciliation isn't like, okay, well, it's better now because I have a better attitude. And that leads towards reconciliation. But reconciliation without truth is only one-sided. And a lot of what Canada does is one-sided reconciliation. It's in the court papers in their first major case that we study is the Calder case. And it says in there, that we have to reconcile the Indigenous people to the Crown. So if you really think about what the definition of that is, reconciling Indigenous people to the crown means assimilate. And the assimilation policies that were created in the early 19th or early 18th centuries are very much alive and well today. We have the Canadian government going around from talking to Indigenous organizations, not the rights holders, but the organizations, about how to implement UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And they're not implementing it in a way that I don't believe would fully satisfy the treaty relationship. The treaty relationship, again, was we're our own people. We have our own rules, our own governance systems. We take care of our own citizens, our people. But the crown says that, no, you're all card-carrying Indians when you're walking on Canada's land. But when did it become Canada's land? I don't know. I guess we just have different views of sharing. And I think if you really want to reconcile the relationship, then perspectives have to change on what sharing that land really means. Does it mean making agreements with Indigenous people, giving them 50 million bucks while the Canadian government reaps benefits of billions of dollars and destroys the land that they've held and known for centuries? And I mean, like, known and held lands, like, man, a lot of our territory, like I said, was flooded out because of the hydro dam. And we weren't even negotiated with on that. They just started showing up, started plugging up the river. And that's, again, goes totally against the treaty, because if we're supposed to share, the responsibility of the land, then why are you destroying everything around us? And through that, they created Cedar Lake, which is like freaking multi-miles long, just a fake river. And it flooded out a lot of grave sites, flooded out a lot of hunting, trapping lands. It's a huge mess, and we're still dealing with it. And a lot of our community members won't ever get over that, even if there was that understanding and truth involved in it. Like, I don't know how to make a empathetic comparison to it, but it's just been destroyed. It doesn't exist anymore. That history, the place we brought our children to trap and teach, is gone. Our school is gone, right? So we don't get to educate ourselves anymore. And education in our society was taking care of each other, like living and experiencing, being part of something, not just sitting in school and being graded on something or strapped because you got the wrong answer. It was, oh, you made a mistake. What did you learn from that mistake? In Cree society, one of our biggest teachers is Wissahiachuk. And Wissahiachuk is one of the first created beings who Creator put down to earth to say, take whatever form you need to take to teach these people how to carry themselves with humility, truthfully, with honesty, and how to respect other people, and how to survive, basically. So some people have translated Wissahiachuk as kind of like a demon, like a trickster. And he is a trickster, but it's not an evil trickster. It's like if you continuously stub your toe on the coffee table, eventually you're going to move the coffee table. Well, Wissahiachuk is that coffee table. That's neither here nor there, I guess, in the treaty conversation, but that's what treaties mean to us. A peaceful coexistence, a way of both surviving together. And what we've seen from the treaties that we've made all across Canada, what we've seen in the treaties that we've made with the Crown are the rich get richer, and we get to observe that. That's about it. I guess I can open for questions. I'll go all damn day on this if you got more time. But that's been what's that been? Almost an hour, eh?
That's why this is why I wanted to invite Jason for 2 sessions.
So yes, we have more like, I know this topic is very complex and it's very long, but we have around like 20 minutes. If somebody has questions, please put it on the chat, and then at the end we can actually, oh, Angela. So Angela, if you want to ask questions, just feel free.
Hi, I'm calling from Toronto, and I just wanted to say thank you for your discussion. And I have a few questions with regards to what you were talking about. I missed the first session, so perhaps this is a repetition. But in terms of ceremony grounds versus burial grounds, can you talk about the distinction of those? And also, you mentioned something about hunting and tracking lands, and also the land, you made a statement about the land not being what it was because of the dams sort of destroying the original place. And you said the land where we brought our kids to learn and to teach has been destroyed. So if you could just go over those briefly or in depth.
So
again.
yeah, the trapping lands was like families brought their children out with them. Even in my father's own generation, my grandfather was a trapper, and they would leave their homes and go trapping for what when I grew up, I thought trapping was like a couple of weeks out there, catch a couple of muskrat, catch some rabbit, and away you go. They were out there all winter long, which in Winnipeg and this territory that's like 4 months at least. They would bring a tent, they would live together on the land, and they would learn about the relationship to the land. And I'm not being hokey about it. I mean, like, there's an actual relationship to the land. Like, you can imagine the old man sitting there talking about what the eagle's responsibility is to our people, or like why it's important to give to the tree when the tree gives us fruit, or the berries, why you give your tobacco to the strawberries when you pick the strawberries, or why you put tobacco down when you collect sage, because you're giving something for receiving something. You're not just like, oh yeah, I get it, this is all me, this is mine. And that's the education process of reciprocation. Like, you learn those stories, and then you'd also learn stories sitting with the elders by the fires in the trapping lines, talking about Wissahickok stories, or talking about like different clan stories, different historical accounts. That was our education. That taught us how to be good to each other, how to resolve conflict, and how to take care of each other, which is a value-based system. We're not a punitive kind of based system, which is a lot like what Canadian law is. When you make mistakes, you are accountable, you are responsible, and you hold up for that. And a lot of that was how we were taught. We were taught by being with our elders. It was that whole cycle of children teach the elders teach the children, right? Youth and the adult as well. So when I say that land is gone, what I mean is the hydro dam in Grand Rapids. I can't remember the number of acres. I think it's like a 9-mile river, a 9-mile long lake, Cedar Lake, was created. So you're talking like, here's the land you used to be able to walk on, and you used to go here and pick. That was the best berry patch in all the world, and all the animals came over here, so you'd be able to hunt. And now it's all water. When you go over it on boat, you can see the trees are still coming up under the water. Like, it just drowned. It drowned the land. So that's what I mean by it's destroyed. And then there was another part to your question that I went backwards on it, and I forgot it. The first part.
I've forgotten too, because I asked multiple questions, and Julian does know that about me, so my apologies. But I think, oh yes, it was the distinction between ceremony grounds versus burial grounds. And I did have another question to sneak in, but I'll put it in the chat in case somebody else would like to ask you a question.
Burial grounds were just like a cemetery, for lack of better terms. There's different burial processes for Indigenous people. Some would build like kind of like what are they, scaffolds, I guess. They would put the body on the top and either burn it or let it find its own way home, or they would be buried in mounds with their relatives and their belongings, things that were held sacred to them, like their bundles. So in that, and then the ceremonial grounds is like, well, here's the best spot to put a shake tent. So this is our shake tent ceremonial grounds. This is the best space for our Sundance. So this will be our Sundance grounds. This will be the best space for, you know, we're not going to do anything on this land because that's where we've been feeding our nations from strawberries and raspberries and boysenberries or whatever berries exist there. So that's that particular ground, and we hold it sacred because that area provides for us in a distinct way. Ceremonial grounds are also quote unquote powwow grounds. We see powwows now a lot differently because in the 40s, when our culture was attemptedly erased by the Indian Act, where it made it illegal for us to gather in groups and perform ceremonies, the powwow changed to more of a marketing kind of approach, we were allowed to visually represent our culture because it was entertaining to non-Indigenous societies. And then that's how that became more of a, you dance for money as opposed to like a grass dancer. A grass dancer might win an award, but back in the day, the grass dancers were the ones who flattened the earth so that we could build our teepees on that territory. It's changed significantly, but that's ceremonial grounds would have been gatherings, and gatherings weren't just like, hey, let's all, you know, tailgate party and stuff like that. First off, we didn't have tailgates, but secondly, when we gather, we would talk about, like, say the Cree met with the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe met with the Newa, and we would discuss what was going to happen with this territory. The next migration of the elk are coming through here, so how are we going to share that responsibility? How can we help you build your nation? Do you need supplies? Do you need food? How's everything with your people and our people? That harmonious kind of relationship. And that happened in our territory, just northern Manitoba. There was gatherings, places that people went to every summer, and every summer the families would get together and discuss what needed to happen. I say family is not like, hey, my brother and sister. I mean, like, families like the clans. The clan systems got together, and that was their responsibility. Heron, I believe, is like a spiritual, religious kind of responsibility. Bear Clan is the law making and treaty protection. There's all sorts of different responsibilities to that, and that's what they would discuss on those ceremonial grounds.
And I know, like, Lindsay has her hand up, and also Charisma. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. So Lindsay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a little bit to the conversation we were having about land displacement, and just to get this in people's minds to think about, you know, there's what we're trying to explain here with all these pieces is that there's an intention, right? There's an underlying intention that's there in every single thing that the government does, all the way up until today. There's an intention behind everything. So what's interesting when we're talking about, you know, our communities being relocated or different areas being kind of, you know, attacked, essentially, is what it is. And what that is, and what I think is really interesting, that speaks to just how powerful relationship with land is that a lot of times what happened is they would displace our communities and basically taking, you know, like Jason was saying, the best blueberry patch, or like the best hunting grounds, or, you know, there's no coincidence that so many communities were created by the water, right? In particular, in a lot of the provinces in the area, the land base. But what's interesting about it is there was also the underlying intention of, oh, well, if we place the Indians over here in a really rough terrain, that eventually maybe they'll weed themselves out, that we wouldn't survive. And that was also an underlying tactic. But they underestimate the connection of land and those original instructions that we all had that had had us surviving and thriving for thousands and thousands and thousands of years pre-contact, right? So what would happen is we would go into these areas. My reserve is a good example. Half of the reserve that's in Six Nations is marsh, right? And that wasn't really our traditional territory, but we still thrived anyway because we took care of the land and we adjusted, and then in turn the land took care of us and continues to do that. So ultimately frustrating the hell out of the government because we just, we're survivors, we're resilient. So, but it's all based on that connection and the relationship to land. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Lindsay, for sharing. And then we have a Charisma, and also a Bradley Clemens has a question. So I'm going to wait for Charisma if you want to unmute yourself and let us know your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Jason, for your wonderful talk and sharing your story with us. I was reminded of this book that I'm currently reading right now called Braiding Sweetgrass. You've probably heard of it, by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's a fantastic book, and it's really teaching me a lot about like what human beings' relationship with the land is. And actually, I feel like when I was a child, I knew a lot of these things because there was some inherent connection to the land. But as I grew up, I kind of forgot some of these things. Like I remember taking care of a butterfly that had like broke its wing. But yeah, it was just a fantastic book. And some of the things that you mentioned here just reminded me of that. One thing I was wondering though, I'm just curious to hear from you is I'm very interested in hearing a lot about various Indigenous perspectives and learning about the knowledges. And I want to share these things with like my peers who may not be as knowledgeable about these things, but I'm wondering what an appropriate way of doing that is, because I know there's also people who are knowledge keepers and various other roles that are in that position to kind of share these stories, but I'm just wondering what's an appropriate way of doing that.
It's that's like being able to speak for everybody. I can't do that, but when you do, take it with a grain of salt as well, and give everybody an open ear, right? As long as you don't be naive by it at all, by any means. But in my community in Mississipauga Cree Nation, part of my job is going around talking to people about what they need to see in a new child family services system, a new model, and we're heading in the direction of something that's completely foreign to Canada because, well, we're foreign to the Crown. Like that's who we are. So we're building something entirely unique to our distinct society. And so what I have to do is I make meetings with elders, and I go and I talk to them at their houses. And I'll tell you, every time I go outside an elder's door, I'm like, okay, what am I gonna get from them today, right? And every time I walk out of those meetings, I am in love with that elder. Like they are amazing people. Do they share me with like what knowledge, quote knowledge? No, but sometimes yes, sometimes no. But it's that time together, and every single one of them has told me that our community, and I'd imagine it quite similar with other communities, is we used to visit each other all the time. If you were hungry, you could go across the street over to Elder Jan's house, and she'd have bannock ready at her table for you, or she'd make an egg for you, or something like that, right? And that's how our communities were. But for some reason, we've been taught to like, we mind your privacy and never interrupt other people and stuff like that. I mean, rightfully so, but we were much more open at one point. And I'd say just reach out, make an approach. I love books too. I think they're great, but you give me an elder and I'll sit with that elder for 6 hours over flipping through pages about an elder, Did I kind of answer your question? Or
yeah, thank you so much.
I think what I'm trying to get at is I'm pretty sure I would bet 80% of my integrity on the idea that the elders want to talk to you.
Thank you, Jason. We actually have a question from Bradley. Bradley, I don't know if you would like to unmute yourself or if you want me to read the question. So it's totally up to you.
Sure. I was just wondering about, given that many people here are involved in the arts, if you have any thoughts about connections between treaty relationships and creative expression or the arts at all. I know it's a broad question, but I'm curious about just any thoughts you might have.
Well, yeah, I'm not really artistic. But have you seen Monkman's pieces? He kind of speaks to that relationship. Like that's not really a treaty relationship, but that's more of a depiction of what the treaty relationship has become. Like Indigenous people running from priests, or just the horrific graphic that shows that reality. And I think that that's purposeful. Like it's meaningful. It shows like, hey, this is what our reality is. Like we're impoverished people. From an artistic viewpoint of the treaties, in Manitoba, the Treaty Commission of Manitoba has this slogan saying, "We are all treaty people," and great, we're all treaty people, but do you know what your responsibilities to the treaty are? Like say you're a mining company, you're a treaty entity. Your responsibility to the Indigenous people as much as you have a responsibility to follow Canada's laws. And that doesn't mean okay, well then we'll do an environmental study for the next 3 years as a mining company because our responsibilities to Canada. It also means like we'll do an environmental study, but we'll also really come to understand the community that we're about to work with. And that would echo, I believe, through the arts too. Like if you're doing a depiction of the relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown, well, what are you? Do you know enough of the truth to actually depict that truth, right? Don't get me wrong, I don't know everything about treaties. I will likely never know everything about treaties, and it takes a long time. But you know what, man, I love putting my head into it, and it's kind of, if I'm ever going to be a one-trick pony, that's my selling point. But yeah, I would say learn as much as you can and be truthful about it. Like, and if you think you know everything that you need to know for the depiction that whatever you create, then question yourself, because your chances are that you won't. Through my previous work, I wrote 2 books out of the Treaty 5 Summit for our people, and we put a lot of information into it. But each time we talked about the Royal Proclamation, we talked about the Rupert's Land Agreement, different historical events and its impact on Indigenous people. But I never wrote anything conclusively. I've always written in a way that I know that I don't know everything, so I'm going to leave room for evolution, and made it clear to people that I'm not that source of everything. I didn't get, again, rambling answer, but do your best for both sides of the party.
Thank you, Bradley, for the question. And also, if anybody else has a question for Jason, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can also put it on the chat.
And you know what? I'm back on May 17th on Tuesday. So if you think of things between now and then, maybe we can open up with questions, and then I'll get into a little bit of a spiel. Sorry, I didn't prepare a presentation because what I like to do is I draw out the story, like a pictograph kind of thing, right? I'll be like, okay, so we had these sacred fires, and then these boats came by, and then they put their fires out, and our women weren't all, I'll draw it all out so that people can kind of follow the story. I like doing stuff like that. If I can find a way to do that for the next talk, then I'll do that. But in the meantime, yeah, feel free. Like, I'm not here to fool you. So if you think of anything that you don't know, I understand that you don't know. Like I said, when I went to law school, I went in at about 85% thinking people knew what they were doing because it's law. These are supposed to be the smartest people. That's a facade, man. And I had to tone it down to about 12%, just because it would have gotten violent in a lot of situations where it's like, how are you that ignorant? I sat beside a law professor, one of my professors, and I was explaining residential schools and how the basis of residential schools was to assimilate the Indian. And he right beside me said to me, well, I don't think that was what it was all about. Fucking almost died inside. My spirit left my body for a second and it had its own conversation, and then it came back and said, calm down, calm down. But other people in the classroom were there to say, no, that is exactly what it was, which is great for me. If I went to law school as a younger person, I'd have been thrown out right there. Docked out. Anyway, rambling.
Thank you, Jason. Angela, you had a question? Angela, please go.
Yes, my question to you, Jason, is: are there any, to your knowledge, present day markers of, again, the ceremonial grounds and the burial grounds that you know of?
No, not really. And that's kind of like saying, hey, where's the best blueberry patch? You know, it's something we keep to ourselves, especially sacred grounds. There's Canada's way of doing it is either through UNESCO or Indigenous cultural spaces, protected areas, Indigenous cultural protected areas, something like that. What we don't like about Indigenous cultural from a sovereignty perspective is that that's Canada's way of claiming our land and holding it like this is sacred to everybody. But they don't understand the sacredness of it, and they get to make all the laws and rules about what happens in that, like say charge admission for it, or sell it off in 20 years to the military, whatever they need to do, right? So we want to have that jurisdiction for ourselves to say these are our sacred grounds. You know, this is where we've done shake tent ceremonies in this area for the last 5,000 years. We'd like to continue doing that because that's where we get our foresight for the community. Go ahead, Daniel. Danielle, sorry, can't read.
No problem. Sorry if I'm a little hard to hear. I'm quite sick, so nasal and all that. Thank you so much, Miigwech, for the talk so far. I was wondering, what you just mentioned about sort of the internal conflicts and that you had to deal with in terms of the differences of opinions around residential school. It brought up something for me. I remember attending a talk called around what was called like the discussions of the civil society, and they had at the time the former Canadian Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin there, and she made a comment to me that was by effect saying that that the residential school system was well intentioned. And when you mentioned what you were experiencing in your end, it struck me because, and I remember at the end of it, I asked a question about that, and she basically took my words like very literally and dodged the question. It was how I had phrased it, but she knew what I was asking, but she never answered it. And I got the same kind of support from the other people around their group. A lot of people came up to me afterwards, and they were very supportive of my concern and sort of the issues that I raised with that. My question was what's your feeling of like ideas of cultural genocide, and is it, for me, I feel that it's genocide point blank. I don't see the distinctions, but I didn't know if from your perspective, if you thought that those distinctions were important, or it was more important that we're having those conversations than not, or is something like a term like cultural genocide sort of dodging the issue, the very important issues and discussions that we need to be having. And Miigwech, again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Cultural genocide, in my opinion, is the safest way of declaring genocide as an existence. If you think that it's over, take a look again, because we're card-carrying Indians. And what I mean by card-carrying Indian is the government of Canada has decided who is identified as a First Nation person. I have 2 children, and they are not identified as First Nation children. I am First Nation. I am identified through the government of Canada, but they will not recognize my children because of their laws of segregating our own members from our own community. So yeah, I think cultural genocide is just to get rid of the cultural part, because it's a genocide. You're erasing a people. You're erasing a people's way. You're erasing their worldview. You're taking away a responsibility that was given to them, to their land. And that's what it is. And if we're not careful, there won't be Indigenous people in the next 50 years. It almost happened in 1969 with the white paper. Trudeau's dad created this document that said, you're just citizens. You know, if you don't speak your languages and stuff like that, then you're just citizens. Well, we don't speak our languages because you sent us to schools that told us we weren't allowed to use our languages, right? You told us that we were inferior in every single way. And that has been like, that's not it. Don't think of that as an individual thing. Think of that like as a constant lesson against an entire group of people for 75 to 96 years, being told that you cannot be an Indian, right? And then all of a sudden this guy shows up and says, well, if you're not going to be an Indian, then we're not going to recognize your rights. And that hasn't changed. There was an email release or a conversation, a document that was released where I think it was Jean Chrétien was talking about it. It was like, we won't be as obvious with the white paper, but we'll still implement that white paper. And that's what we're fighting against, that we're seeing. About McLaughlin, though, she came to the law school one time and I bold-faced asked her, same with you, kind of a dodge the question. I said, do you think that Canadian courts are the best way to resolve Indigenous issues when the Canadian courts don't have knowledge about what the Indigenous truths are? And she looked at me and she was like, well, that's why we need more Aboriginal lawyers. And I was like, well, that's why you need to learn more about us. You know, like we kind of had like a head-to-head. I don't have that, you're an authority figure, so I'm going to automatically respect you. I don't have that gene. I don't get myself into too much trouble with it, but I like that I don't have it because it gives me a chance to say the truth to people who need to hear the truth. Governor General Johnston, years ago, 2014, I think, no, 2013, he was given this presentation in Toronto. And this is the Governor General of Canada, like the guy who says, I'll approve this law. I ran into him as a joke. I was like, let me take a selfie with you, send it to my dad. We'll have a good laugh. And then he said, well, walk with me. So I was like, well, shit. All right. So I was walking with him and he asked me, this is the time of Idle No More, that era, where our people were finally being recognized as like, hey, there's some truth here. There's some distinction here. Something's going on. And it was at that time they were creating, and the government of Canada was creating a First Nations Education Act. And that was through a partnership with the AFN. I said earlier that Canada talks to the organizations. Organizations are not rights holders. Organizations are federally funded advocate bodies. I don't dispose them. I don't work for them. But I think what they need to do is a better job of advocating, of saying, like I said, with me and women, if you have an issue about Indigenous women, I'll refer you to Lindsay. I'm not going to answer that question for you, right? And I think that's what advocacy organizations need to do. Anyway, so I'm walking with him and he says, well, what do you think of this First Nation Education Act? And I said, well, I don't like it. And he goes, well, what don't you like about it? I said, well, if our treaties were honored, then we'd have our own Education Act and you'd be able to respect that Education Act. He goes, well, what about the money? Don't you want the money? And at that time, there was like billions of dollars on it or something like that. And I said, again, if the treaties were honored, we wouldn't need your money. We would have our own, and we could support our own nations in that way. And then he goes, well, change it then. And I said, I intend to. Biggery bastard.
Jason, I have a question, and it might come from my ignorance, but
Hey, before you finish that sentence, again, I know what Canada has done to its citizens. It's created you as ignorant people. And I don't say that offensively. I say that as like, they have not taught you what the Indigenous relationships are. So I understand that. Like, I expect you to not know. So I'm glad that you're asking the question.
Thank you for saying that, because I talked to Lindsay before, and it's a complex conversation for me because I am indigenous from Latin America, from Colombia, and also I was telling Lindsay, like, sometimes I feel bad because I know more about indigenous peoples in Canada, in Turtle Island, than in Colombia, because I moved here when I was very young, and the conversations in Latin America are not as, at least I do not want to use the term, but something like proactive. But my question, as I mentioned before, is about, do you believe that there is a process that is happening already, like it's already a process in place that is going to get us there, to get us to a point where, because when you're talking, you remind me of the Tour Wampum Belt, and then like respecting each other's ways of living, ways of perceiving life, ways of persecuting, way of doing things around Turtle Island. Do you think that that this is something that is happening?
Yes, I do. I know that it is. There's right now across the country, there's a lot of what they call nation rebuilding exercises. This is a federal government funded opportunity for First Nations to rebuild their traditional governance systems. The CFS law is an example of that. The Child Family Services Law. Canada, through Bill C-92, has allowed Indigenous people to take jurisdiction over child family services in their own nations. We're creating one where every child from Mississipaugastic Cree Nation that has heritage to First Mississipaugastic Cree Nation will fall under our jurisdiction, whether they're born and raised in BC or born and raised in Nova Scotia. They fall under our jurisdiction. That's an exercise with limitation, but we're writing it so that there's no limitation. That is a step towards it. There's also a process that the federal government is offering rights, recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination. So it's another funding envelope where we get to have negotiations with the Crown about taking over jurisdiction over our affairs. So say citizenship, policing, education, health services, and re-scripting our own laws that fit our own people. And again, not all of it's just going to be like a return to traditions. Like you can't. We're not in that era anymore, and we shouldn't, because like I'm not going to go pick dandelions to cure a headache when I can just open a bottle of Tylenol and away I go. Right? There are exercises. Again, Canada wants to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but they've interpreted that as they've watered it down to fit their constitution, their interpretation, right? And that's what the danger behind everything is Canada really has to let go of the idea that they can and need to control the Indian people, right? We are a self-determining people. We have taken care of our own for centuries, thousands of years before settlers even showed up. Let us take control of our own people again. There's such a parental kind of attitude about it. Like even when I talk about treaties, if you were all studying law or something like that, you'd be like, well, I don't think that's what it is, right? Like treaties aren't about taking care of the land. You don't have a tobacco for sage. That's not a treaty, but it is because there's a spirituality involved in it. And we're not asking Canada to adopt that spirituality, that indigenous deity. We're just saying respect the fact that we have that. So to answer the question in short, yes, but with control systems in place. And once those control systems are out of place, removed, then we can be free to be our own people again.
Thank you, Jason. So it's already 6:30. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions, and also Jason, if you want to open up the conversation for next session with a question, or for us to, in Colombia we say like consulting with the pillow, kind of like going and take it and
okay,
then bring it next week. Yeah.
Let's do that. I'll leave the question with you of like, what is your responsibility to the treaty? In the area that you live in, what is your responsibility to that treaty? And then I got all your names now, so I'm gonna look for answers from everybody, and it will be graded. I'm just kidding. Or at least maybe it'll at least get you inspired to look for more information about treaties, right? And again, cautiously, like I said, you with a grain of salt when you talk to elders. Also, I don't honestly believe most of what I read. The treaty documents themselves are parchments written by non-Indigenous people with a purpose of overtaking Indigenous people. So if you do read the treaty itself, know that it's written from one side and try to open your mind and explore what the other side of the party has to say. That's all. Hey, listen, thank you very much for listening to me. I'm humble and grateful for the opportunity. I am not an expert in anything. I know some stuff, and it's my responsibility to share that stuff.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your sunny, maybe cold, maybe not cold day, wherever you are in Canada, Turtle Island. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank you also to Lindsay for leading this project, for curating these iTalks as well, for us to learn more about the land. Jason, I will have more questions for you. I already have a couple, but I'm gonna wait
Okay.
until next session that we can ask them. But have a wonderful one. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good one.
And Danielle, get better.
And Jason, if you can let me know what would you like me to do with the offering of tobacco, please let me know as well.
Are you in vicinity of Lindsay?
No, and I'm in Toronto.
Okay. Do you have? Would you mind just kind of tucking it under a cedar tree in your territory?
Yeah, for sure. I will look for one. I don't know how they look
Okay.
like. I will look for one.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Have
Thank
a
you
good
so
one,
much,
everyone.
Jason.
Thank you, everybody.